Hey guys, Stephen Cox here, and today we're going to talk about some chords. We're going to talk about how you can use chords, what they mean to us as bass players, and what we can play over chords as well. But if you like videos like these and you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. I want to mention that I have a Patreon that you can go and check out. And if you like videos like these, go ahead and like it below. And I also am teaching Skype lessons, and there's a discount running through the end of May. So if you want to, you can visit stephencoxmusic.com/Skype. And I'll go ahead and put that in the description if anybody wants to check it out, and we'll just jump right in. Okay. Hey Tristan, how's it going? Be funny if I misspelled it. Okay, so first, there are a lot of different kinds of chords that we can go over. So we've got power chords that guitar players use in rock a lot, and that's just two notes at the same time. We have other two-note chords that we call double stops. Then we have some three-note chords, and we could do major chords, minor chords, seventh chords, diminished chords, augmented chords, suspended chords. There's a whole bunch of different types. I'm not sure that we'll get to all of them today, but we'll get over some of the most common ones. Hey, Robert, how's it going? And then after we talk about chords, what they mean to us as bass players, and how we can also use them to loop and things of that nature, then after that, I'll get into answering your questions. Okay, so first, what is a chord? Well, a chord is playing more than one note at the same time. So this doesn't typically happen on bass as much, but you could play two notes at the same time. You could play three notes at the same time, which there are a lot of different types of that. You could even play four notes at the same time, although if we do that on bass, it'll start sounding a little bit muddy. If I try to come up with an example, it'll have to be really high up on the neck so that it doesn't sound quite as muddy. Let's see. See if I can do this. Yeah, we'll just kind of avoid those for today, but you get the idea. So we can kind of do different things with chords, but we're going to be sticking to two-note chords and three-note chords today. So if you're playing rock and roll, there's a thing called a power chord. I'm not going to play any more of that, but basically you play a fifth at the same time. So if we remember back from when I was teaching you guys major scales, if you play a major scale, you can play the first note of that scale and the fifth note of the scale, and then you can play those at the same time. We can either pluck them or we can strum them like I was doing a second ago. When we strum on the U bass, you get that very clicky kind of attack. So just probably use it sparingly. But power chords just have that rock and roll sound. You can use them in punk rock. You can use them for metal. You can use them for classic rock. Just a bunch of things like that. But we don't typically do them on bass a lot, just every now and then and on some solo bass stuff. So to do a power chord at the same time, what I generally do is I start on one fret. So let's take the third fret on the D string, and then you go up 2 frets. So you plus 2, you end up on the 5th fret, and then you take that note to the next string thinner. So if we were on the D string, we could take that note if we were on the 3rd fret on the D string, our second note would be the 5th fret on the G string. So there's always an empty fret in between, and you can typically just use your pointer finger and your ring finger to play it. If you're on a full scale bass, you may want to use your pinky instead down low here, but otherwise I'd really just still do the first finger and the third finger. All right, so once we've got our power chords, we can move those around, right? And we're just leaving one fret empty in between, and we're starting on a thicker string and going to one string thinner. So this works pretty well on the D and the G string, If we start doing it on the A and the D string, it starts sounding a little bit muddy. And then if we go all the way down to the E string and the A string, it kind of starts sounding like you're trudging through mud at that point. It's really hard to distinguish the two different notes. So for that reason, I like to keep them on the D and the G string and occasionally on the A and the D string. Okay, so we got those 2-note chords, right? So let's do a different one. So that's a power chord. This next one is playing thirds. So thirds, you can either have a major third or a minor third. So if we know our major scale, that's from the first note to the third note of the scale. Okay? And if we were doing it in a minor scale, you might notice that the first note and the third note are on the same string. So it's kind of hard to play those at the same time. So what we got to do is we got to take the third note of the scale, and then we've got to subtract 5 frets from it and move it 1 string thinner. So if we do that, let's say right here, I'm on the 5th fret on the A string. So the third note of the minor scale is going to be the 8th fret on the A string. Well, we're going to take just the 8th note on the A string, and we're going to subtract 5 frets from it. So 8 minus 5 is 3, and we're going to move it down 1 string thinner. See how they're basically the same note? They're the same pitch, but they sound a little bit different due to how long the string is. But they are the same pitch. They are both F notes. So then we can play the first note of the scale and the third note of the scale at the same time. So that's a minor third when it's from the minor scale. And then if we do it from the major scale, first note, third note, we end up with a major third. Once again, I'm doing these on the A and the D string right now, and that's a little bit muddy. So I'm just going to give you an example on the D and the G string. So let's take the 7th fret on the D string, and if we were to play up that scale, that would be the A major scale. We'd run out of notes. We'll just do the first 5 notes instead of going up here. But we just go to our first note to the third note, and we've got our major third. Play both those at the same time. And then if we want to play a minor third, we do the same thing where we subtract 5 frets from this note to get it down on the next string. So that's going to be 10th fret minus 5. You end up on the 5th fret of the G string. And then you play that with the first note of the scale as well. So that ends up being an A and a C for a minor third, or an A and a C sharp for a major third. So after we have that, we can move these chords around. If we were to apply them to a major scale, it would sound kind of like this. So basically what I did was my ring finger, or the notes on the D string, sometimes it was my ring finger, sometimes it was my middle finger, but that finger on that string is just literally doing a major scale on 1 string, which there's a video on my beginner playlist that teaches you how to do that. It's the major scale video. So you could just literally practice going. But then once you have that down, you just got to know that off that first chord, we're going to do a major third. Off the second one, we're going to do a minor third. Off the third one, we're going to do a minor third. Off the 4th note of the scale, we'll do a major third. Off the 5th note of the major scale, we'll do a major third. Off the 6th note, we'll do a minor third. Off the 7th note, we'll do a minor third. And then we're back to the note we started on. It was F down here. It's a higher F up here. That'll be a major third. So now all of a sudden we have a whole bunch of stuff that we can do. And once we memorize kind of which thirds are which, we can kind of build melodies that are harmonized out of this. And then if we really wanted to, we could take it a step further and do progressions that are very common. So we could do a 1, 4, 5. There's our root. Then we go to the 4th note of the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll know that that's a major third. And And then we'll do the fifth note of the scale, which will also make a major third if we did a chord on top of it. So we've got. So then we could just play those in a certain rhythm. And it sounds like a whole bunch of familiar songs, right? You could name like 5 or 6 just from doing that. So I'm just going to do it with that rhythm. And I'm going to build a loop out of that. So I'm going to loop that first and then come up with a bass line. So hopefully everything is set right and will work. Okay. So if we want to turn this into a loop, we could just add a drum beat to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slap the bass drum sound and strum for a snare drum sound. So that was slap, strum, slap, slap, strum, slap, strum. And what I'm doing with my left hand is I'm muting the strings so that I don't have a note ring out. It's just the percussive sound of the strings. Okay, so we know we're in the key of F. So I'm going to use the major scale down here. Let me turn off. And I might use the notes from the chord that we were doing a second ago, where we have the third in there. I might play back and forth between those notes on each one just to give it a little bit more of a bass line. At that point, I have a loop that I'm pretty happy with, and I could just play a melody over it or solo over it. And this is all in the key of F. So that's one example of a little loop that we can do out of those chords. All right. So then after that, I'm going to do one that we talked about earlier with fifths. So if we want to sound kind of rockin', we could play something. Same idea where we do a 1-4-5 progression, but now it'll have more of a punk rock or alternative rock kind of feel. This is an E. So you get the idea with that one. So fifths tend to have more of that kind of vibe to them. You can use them for metal if you have distortion and a whole bunch of things like that. But rock and roll is what I think of when I think of fifths. So we've got our thirds, major and minor thirds, and we've got our fifths, which we didn't really go into a whole lot of detail on that. But basically, the thing that that a lot of people like about fifths is that it implies nothing about the chord being major or minor. So you can really use that over either major chords or minor chords. So that's the reason a lot of people like using power chords, is they just work in more places without having to alter anything. Okay, so then we have another kind of two-note chord called a tenth. And I have a video on this already, so I'm just going to go over it very briefly. A tenth is a third spread out over an octave. So like, let's say we took our third and we were playing a G note and a B note. So that's the 5th fret on the D string and the 4th fret on the D string. Well, all I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the third, which is that B note, alone. So that one's going to stay the same. But I'm going to take this note down the octave. So this is a G on the 5th fret on the D string. But we're going to do the lower octave, which is the 3rd fret on the E string. It's also a G. And we're going to leave the other note where it was. So we've got our thirds, but it's spread out over an octave. So now they're called tenths. So because of that, that one's a major third. But if we were to lower that third 1 fret, just like with our pattern before with the major thirds versus the minor thirds, now we have a minor tenth versus a major tenth. So once again, we could do our scale on one string. Then we could just do that pattern, and you got to know which ones are major and which ones are minor. Okay. Hola, Francisco. So we're going to have our one chord is major. So when we play the G note, we're going to be playing a major tenth. And then when we get to the second note, we have a minor chord. The third note will be the first. Let me say that clearly. The third chord in the scale will be minor. So we have a minor tenth there. Then the 4th note in the scale we'll build a major tenth off of. The 5th note's also going to be major. The 6th note's going to be minor. The 7th note we're going to build a minor. And then our last note up here, we've got our G major tenth. So you can literally just go up the scale. And then you can kind of make melodies out of that too, which if you listen to some of my songs, you know that I like doing that a lot. So like sometimes I'll play a tenth, then I'll fill in the gaps over here. Right? So you could do that, but you could also make a whole entire melody out of the tenths. Yeah. And you got to remember which ones are major and which ones are minor, and you got to be accurate. So it's a little bit harder to do, but if you work on it, you can kind of get it. You can kind of make melodies out of that. And because we have that low note and that high note, we don't really need to use the loop pedal as much unless we want to have like a drum backbeat or something. So let me do that real quick. I'm going to do the drum backbeat and then play just a song made up of tenths. So I'm just going to make one up. Thanks for stopping in. What part of the world are you coming in from? What is it? Hangio? Not sure how to pronounce your name or your screen name. So you get the idea on that. You can kind of make melodies out of tenths, and because they're like harmonized, you have a bass line with it. So then we can get into 3-note chords. And basically what we want to do there is build the chord off of the arpeggio. So it's the same notes as if we were playing 1, 3, 5 of a scale. But now we've got to figure out how to play those on different strings. So let's say we're playing a G up here. This is the 10th fret on the A string. And we want to do a major chord up here. So we've got our arpeggio, G, B, D, or 10th fret on the A string, 9th fret on the D string, and 12th fret on the D string. So now we can leave the third of the scale, meaning the middle note of the arpeggio, where it's at, and play the root and the third at the same time. But now we want to take that 5th note and be able to play it on the next string down, which is the G string. So we have to do to get this 12th fret note on the D string down to the G string is we've got to subtract 5 frets before we move it down to that string. And I say down, it's up in pitch, but it's physically down toward the floor. So 12 minus 5 is 7. And so that'll be the 7th fret on the G string. So we've got the 10th fret on the A string, the 9th fret on the D string, and then the 7th fret on the G string. We play all 3 of them at the same time. And so we've got a major chord there. Now, I'm not going to go through and loop this one, but you can play a major chord like that. Or since we already know that it's major from the 3rd, we can kind of leave out the 5th and just play the 3rd. And if we really wanted to, we could add another root on top. So if we have a G down here, we could add a G up high. So we've got a G, a B, and a G. So that still implies that same chord. Thanks, John. I'm glad you like these. So that's kind of our goal there. So now we've got our major chord. Well, to make the chord minor, the only note that we really need to change on either of these two patterns is that middle note. So that's the 3rd of our scale. And like we said earlier when we were talking about thirds, you can have a major 3rd or you can have a minor 3rd. The only difference is that 3rd note of the scale moves down 1 fret. And that's the only difference. So if we were doing this kind of major chord, the root of the chord and the 5th of the chord would stay the same, and that middle note could just move down 1 fret to make it minor. So there's a G minor chord. And here's a G major chord. We move that 1 middle note up a fret. If you have any questions about this, leave them in the comments below. If it's hard to see on here, for instance, so I'm taking that middle note right here and moving it down 1 fret, but keeping it on the same string. And then my pinky is getting the 10th fret on the A string, and my pointer finger is getting the 7th fret on the G string. And this is a movable pattern, which means that's minor. If we scoot all those notes down 5 frets or something, let's see, we're on the 10th fret, so let's go down to the 5th fret. That's still a minor chord. It's just we built it off of a different root. So now this is a D minor chord instead of a G minor chord. Oh, cool. You're from Vancouver? Hi, Dan. How's it going? Oh, and hey, Jeff. Well, guys, it's good to see some familiar faces. So now that we've got the major chords, we've got the minor chords, and we've got another way to play them, let's start talking about 7th chords. And this is probably going to be as far as we go with chords. I don't think we need to go any further than that. I know I mentioned augmented and diminished chords. They're going to be a lot rarer. You're not going to hear them as much because they sound kind of suspenseful and sometimes a little bit dissonant. So that's a diminished chord, and here's an augmented chord. So that's why we probably won't use those as much. We're more used to hearing major and minor in most songs. Okay, so now let's briefly talk about doing the 7th chords. So what a 7th chord is we take our smaller chord, so we take our root, our 3rd, and our 5th of a scale, and then now we add probably the obvious thing at this point, if you think about the name of it, we're going to add the 7th of the scale to the chord. So if we have a major 7th chord, we're going to take our major scale. We're going to play the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th. And normally we do that at the same time. It's a lot easier to do on piano than it is to do on bass. On bass, in order to do that, let's see. We're doing on a C, root, 3rd, 5th, 7th. So you'd have to stretch your hand like this to play it. It's not fun. So let's not do that. So instead, we can actually leave out one of those notes. So we have our root, we have our 3rd. Let's leave out the 5th, because the 5th doesn't really tell us much about the chord. So we'll just play the root, the 3rd, and the 7th, and the 5th, you can kind of just pretend it's there. It's implied. Okay? So if we were playing a C major 7 chord, we play the root note of the scale, which is a C, 3rd fret on the A string. We play the 3rd, which is the 2nd fret on the D string. And then we play the 7th, which is the 4th fret on the G string. Okay? So that's our major 7 shape. So let's say we want to turn it into a minor 7th. Well, in this case, the 7th and the 3rd are going to both move down. And we could go through the minor scale to figure that out. Or you can just kind of trust me on this and just compare it to a major 7 so that you have something to kind of like compare it to. So if you're playing a major 7 chord, the root of C will stay the same, but these other two will move down a fret. So what I do there is I use my ring finger to get the 7th, and I use my index finger to get the 3rd of the chord. So we're going to be playing a C, an E flat, and a B flat. And that's going to be a minor 7th chord. So C is the 3rd fret on the A string. E flat is the 1st fret on the D string. And then B flat is the 3rd fret on the G string. So I'm playing those notes at the same time. So now that we've got that minor 7th chord, we've got our major 7th chord, which is just the same thing, but these two notes slid up one fret, but that one stayed in the same spot. See? Okay, now that we've got that, let's talk about one more 7th chord. So this one is called a dominant 7th, and this is the one where if you were looking at a chart and you saw like a C7 chord, it just has a C and the number 7. It doesn't say major 7. It doesn't say minor 7. It doesn't have a capital M in between them. It doesn't have a little m in between them. It's just a C and a 7. Well, we're going to basically play the root and the 3rd from the major scale, but we're going to play the 7th that we just did from the minor chord or the minor scale. So instead of this one, we're going to move just the 7th note of the scale down one fret. And so when you see a C7 and it doesn't designate if it's major or minor, it's referring to a dominant 7. It's not important if you can't remember the name right now, but it's important if you're like a classical theory person. Okay. So got our root, our 3rd, and our 7th. So a lot of times guitar players and ukulele players will be playing those kind of 7th chords, especially in the blues. It's a very bluesy sounding chord. So we kind of outline that chord with our bass lines. So like if you hear like we're playing root, 3rd, 5th, 6th, but don't really worry about the 6th. It's just kind of like a melodic note there. And then you got that flat 7 back to 6, 5, 3. So we're literally outlining. So like I'm just going to loop this chord up here and then play that bass line so you can see that we're just outlining that chord. So we got our chord. Now I'm going to play that bass line. So does that make any sense to you guys? If anybody's got any questions down here, let me know. Okay, so that's one thing we can use the seventh chord is the blues. I could go all the way around the changes if y'all wanted to and just play that along with it. It takes a longer time to loop this because the 12-bar blues is 12 measures long instead of just being 3 or 4 measures long. So I'm going to rearrange the notes, though, when I go around the other chords, because if I were to go from C down to F up to G, that's kind of a lot of movement. So sometimes what I do instead is when I do that C7 chord, when I go to F, I'm going to play the F over here. And then the third note of that F chord, so, we could do the major 10th, for instance, instead of the third. So we're just moving the third note of the scale up the octave. We end up with that. And then our seventh is still in the same place in relation to the root, where it's 2 strings down on the same fret, or 2 strings over to a thinner string on the same fret. And then we've got our third moved up an octave, so it's down there. So we could play the F7 chord here instead of here. And they're really the same chord, just voiced differently. Okay, so I'm going to go through using those chords and just kind of like loop a chord progression all the way around the 12-bar blues. This is going to take a minute, but that's what we'll do for now. Now we got this long thing. So I missed the chance to play the first pattern. But you can kind of see that I'm just outlining at 1, 3, 5. So that's the idea. Since that's such a long pattern, I'll go ahead and stop it. But that's kind of how what we're doing relates to the chords they're playing. We're essentially connecting some of the notes with some passing notes from the scales, but we're outlining the same notes that a guitar player would be playing at the same time. So we can play the chords ourselves if we want to have fun with the loop pedal. And if not, we can always just play the bass part. But if you're wanting to loop, it's kind of fun to have multiple things going on at the same time. So does anybody have any questions about any of these chords? Did I lose you guys halfway along, or is anybody still keeping up with everything I said? Does anybody have any specific questions about the chords, first of all? So I'll play something real quick just to see if anybody has a question that pops up in a second. When would you play chords versus single notes? So a lot of times in bass parts, we typically play single notes, but there are bands that get a little bit edgier and stuff that use power chords sometimes. So you might use it in like a trio setting if you're trying to beef up the sound a little bit. Tenths are a really good way to do that. I think I've heard some stuff and some kind of funky things where people go. And there's a Steely Dan song, Peg, where the bass line kind of goes down, underneath the horn line, and then it goes, right? So it's doing, it's doing some tenths up there, and they're all major tenths just moving down. So that's an example of using chords in a bass line to fill out the sound. A lot of times people don't need us to fill out the sound because they're already covering the chords, right? But in a solo setting, you're going to use chords to fill out the sound and actually have harmony against a melody line. And then if you're playing in a trio, a lot of bands like Red Hot Chili Peppers will throw some chords in. There's an intro to a Tool song that uses a lot of two-note chords, right? And then you might use some power chords in some songs. I know Rage Against the Machine actually uses a lot of power chords. So there are just some examples of people using them. But typically, you're not going to use them in bluegrass. If there's anybody that does use them in bluegrass, then they're doing something kind of crazy that's a little out of the norm. You're probably not going to use these chords so much in really even in most rock, most pop, most of those kind of genres, unless maybe you have a trio and you're trying to fill the sound out a little bit more. I know Rush has some songs where they throw some power chords in and they throw some thirds in occasionally as well. But it's typically bands like that, and where there's a little bit more of a lead quality to the bass, or there's a little bit more of an empty feeling if they don't do that. Bands like Primus, if you like Primus, I've got a Primus poster behind me. They're weird, but they use a lot of chords in their music. So I'd say trios filling out the sound, just kind of a little bit, just adding a little bit of color to the songs, just adding an extra texture in. Because sometimes it sounds nice for the bass to do a chord. If you're underneath a guitar solo in a trio, though, it might be necessary for you to do some chords here and there, just so that there's a bass part, but the chord is implied while they're soloing. So just, maybe they were playing the rhythm part the whole entire rest of the song underneath the vocals, and then they went to take a guitar solo, and now all of a sudden it sounds really empty. So you might want to do some chords there as well. But the answer is rarely. So that is a good question. Does anybody else have any chord questions real quick? I'm going to go ahead and pull up one of Robert's questions that was not a chord question, but it was a technique question. So let me see. And if you want to just type it into the comments again, you can. It's just taking me a minute to remember what your question was on here from earlier. Let's see. Oh, okay. I think I remember. Basically, this question is about hand placement. So when we pluck, where do we want to pluck from? And then I'll get back to some other questions here pretty soon. Okay. So a lot of people will pluck in the middle of the neck and the bridge. And to me, I get the tone that I want to the most out of here. It's like the best of both worlds. You're getting the warm tone that you get from playing up near the neck, but you're also getting a little bit of the punch that you get from playing over by the bridge, which apparently doesn't work as well on the flat wound strings. Almost seems like I'm muting it by doing that. So maybe over here. But you hear how it has more punch, but it almost sounds like nasally, like if someone were to plug their nose and talk, it has a little bit of that vibe. Whereas over here, you get like a super duper deep warm sound, but it might get really muddy. But honestly, that's a really good tone. But if you try to play chords over here, they get really muddy. Whereas if you try to play chords over near the bridge, you get a thinner tone. It's a little more punchy. So there's not really a right or wrong there. If you feel more comfortable playing over here, there are bass players that in popular recordings that do that on purpose, and you'll just get that really fat sound. Versus more of like Jocko plays over by the bridge, but you can't really get the details from the U bass. I think with like the jazz bass, the electric bass, you have two pickups, and you have a neck pickup and a bridge pickup. And if you play right over the bridge pickup, you're going to get that bright sound. If you play right over the neck pickup, you're going to get a warmer sound. And if you play over the neck, it's kind of like the whole entire string vibrates more because you're right in the middle of the string almost. So you get a full warm tone, but it may be too full for certain situations. So a lot of times I split the difference and play in the middle of the two. The other advantage to playing near the bridge versus playing near the neck, if you're trying to play a faster passage, which I believe this is why Jaco plays back here, if you're playing really fast notes, there's more string tension over here. The string will wobble a little bit more here, but if you were to try to like move it there, it won't move as much. So if you don't want your fingers to get caught up on the strings as much, and this even works a little bit with the rubber strings too, it'll actually help you not get caught up quite as deeply on the strings. So maybe you can play a little bit closer to in time without having to alter your technique much from electric bass playing to U-bass. But if you play over by the bridge, you get a strong attack out and your fingers don't get kind of stuck on the strings. So you get a clear attack and punchy sound that cuts through so you can tell how fast you're playing. Whereas you lose a little bit of that articulation over here and your fingers can get kind of caught up on the strings. Let me try it on the E string to give you an example. Versus, right? Not the best playing, but you get the idea here. So these are the flat wound strings on this one. I have the round wound strings on a bass right here, and then the rubber strings are way out of this room. I can see the instrument, but I can't quite reach it from here. So I think using round wound strings, you'll get more punch over here. You'll get more of a warm tone over here. So it just depends on the vibe you're going for, but I think that's a really, really good question. All right, so what do I think of 5-string basses? So for the longest time, I played pretty much exclusively 5-string basses. Then I got a 6-string bass. Then I ended up with 3 6-string basses. So right now I have 3 6-string bass guitars, 2 5-string bass guitars. I've had 2 in the past. I guess I only have 1 currently. And then I've got the 4 U basses and 1 4-string bass, and then electric bass, and then the upright bass. So what I think of 5-string basses is they are good if you want that lower pitch, right? I mean, you need them if you're going to do that, because you can tune the E string down, and that works down to maybe a D note. It still sounds good on there. But if you want a low B string, like let's say you're playing a song in B and you want to end the song almost with a thunderous, loud, powerful note, then you really want that 5-string, because that might not sound as powerful as hitting that low string and even hitting both of them together. So that's kind of one reason I really like the 5-string. The other thing that's kind of nice about having more than 4 strings is when you're playing in one position where you're signing your fingers, one finger to a fret. If you have a string down here, you have more notes you can play in that position. So then all of a sudden you have a whole lot of stuff you can do without having to move side to side much. Now, I'll give you a downside to especially a 6-string bass. With a 6-string bass, you have 1 thinner string and 1 thicker string. So that means your neck is going to be a lot wider, first of all. So that means in order to keep your technique good, it's just kind of harder to do. You have to bend your wrist a little bit to reach all the way up to the higher notes if you have a full thickness neck where the strings are spaced the same. So I stopped playing the 6 strings as much because I started developing wrist issues because my wrist was slightly more bent. And that's also why I kind of like push that a lot when we talk about hand position, about not bending the wrist too much, is you get repetitive injury if you have your wrist bent a lot and you're moving, your tendons are kind of, I don't know if they're grinding up against your carpals or the bones in your wrist or not, but it seems like they do a little bit more, and it's just not as good for the mechanics of your hand for whatever reason. Not a biologist or a doctor, so don't quote me on the details of why, but it's just not as good for your wrist. All right. So McCartney does play a little bit more near the neck, and he gets a cool sound there. And if you play with the pick, when you play with the pick, you get more of an attack automatically. But if you're trying to get a so if you want to get a warm sound and have an attack, a pick is a good way to go, right? Because then, but you're still going to get more of an attack when you're closer to the bridge. You're still going to get more of a brighter sound to it. But it's okay, acceptable technique to play down by the bridge, to play in the middle over where the neck pickup would be on most electric basses, or over here on the neck. Either one of those is fine. And then once again, the answer to the other question is 5 strings are great. They are heavier usually. They so just know that going into it. If you have a 5-string bass and you're playing a gig, it might end up being neck heavy because they're going to have a little bit more to the neck in order to have an extra tuner on there. That was one of the problems with one of my 5 strings, was that it would just, if you let go of it, it would just go, So great question. Does anybody else have any questions? So this can be questions pertaining to the U-bass or anything else. And while I'm waiting for questions, I'm going to show y'all something that I got today. This came in the mail. So I've got this new camera. This is a Canon M50, and I'm going to start shooting videos with this. So hopefully my video quality will be a little bit better. Not for the live streams, because with the live streams, I'm still going to be using this webcam. But I'm hoping that this camera will give a clearer image and that the lighting won't flicker as much, so that you guys can see what I'm doing and not be distracted by things like that. So I'm excited about this. I just wanted to share that with you guys. All right. So I see Kala. All right. Is there another question about any of this? If y'all got value out of this, let me know. Give me a thumbs up if you like lessons like these. And then the other thing we could do with chords is we could build a melody on one string and then play an open string with it. So I'm just going to go and backtrack to that. It's kind of related to chords because you're playing 2 notes at the same time. But we're really just playing one as a drone note and the other one's changing. So what I'm doing there is I'm plucking the D string and the G string, and I'm just changing notes on the G string and leaving the D string open. So that's kind of fun to do as well. And you don't have to always play them at the same time. You can play one at a time too if you want to. But that's another way that you might incorporate chords into your playing. Debating whether to get a Kala 5-string or a 4-string Nick West U-bass. I like the Nick West one. I've seen a lot of videos on those. I think was it Ukulele Whales? I think that's her username. She has one, and she did an unboxing video of it and a review of it, and teaches some U-bass lessons on it as well. And I think it's really cool. And then of course, if you just watch the Nick West videos of her playing like Prince songs on it, for instance, it's really cool. And she gets a really good slap sound out of it. She has the round wound strings on it. And yeah, I think that's a really cool one. As far as the Kala 5-string, I haven't gotten to play on one of those yet. So I don't know how well the 5th string comes out. I don't know how well it gets picked up. I imagine it's okay, but if you can find someone with the 5-string, you may want to ask him, hey, does that low string carry very well through the amp? And so if you know somebody that has one, I would ask them that question. It seems like it probably does, but I would just check on that to make sure. I know that in one of the Facebook groups I'm in, it's called U-Bass Freaks, that that basically there are a few people with 5 strings, and some of them have round wound strings on it. Some of them have the rubber strings. They have a 5-string rubber pack. Sorry, I can't talk for a while. But that would be a low a low B string, and then I know somebody in the Facebook group has a high C string instead, so they can do more solo type stuff or chords. Because like I said, the chords sound muddy on the thicker strings. So if you add a thinner string, you can get more of that guitar vibe and maybe fill out the chords a little bit more, maybe do some 4-note chords and not have them sound like mud. So I think 5 strings are cool, and I would love to get one if they still made the was it the SUB, the sub series, because it would be really, really cool to have a 5-string one, but I don't think I really want to spend the full price for the 5-string one. I think if I'm going to do that, I'd rather get a 4-string classy looking thing. But if you get one of the 5 strings, please let me know how it is. And what do I think about Fretless? I think Fretless is really, really cool. And I do think that you'll get a different tone out of it. So basically, if you think about the frets, they shorten where the string vibrates from the bridge to the piece of metal. So that means your string vibration is between here and the piece of metal. And since that piece of metal is cutting the note off, right, you're hearing it ring out a whole bunch like that, right? And you don't have the sound of your finger holding that note down. If I put my finger slightly in front of the fret, it kind of mutes it just a tiny bit, but you still have a metallic sound from the frets. But if you have fretless, it just rings out differently, and sometimes the note have almost more of a purring quality to them. So it's really cool to have the notes kind of purr instead of having that kind of brighter sound, kind of punchier sound. And then fretless, I really want to put the flat wound strings on my fretless. I have it right here. So I'll just go ahead and grab that. I forgot the fretless was here. I know I was saying the rubber string one's out over there, but this one also has the polyurethane strings as well. Polyurethane, rubber, close enough, right? So if you kind of compare the sounds a little bit, hopefully you can hear what I'm saying, that it just has a little bit more of a purr to it. One advantage is like if you do a vibrato, you get more of a vibrato out of less motion, which I know you can't hear that too well right now, but I'll plug it in a second once I get it tuned. Cool. Now, fretless is harder to play because it's harder to stay in tune. If you have the fret lines, I know this one doesn't, but if you have the fret lines on there, I think that's better because then you know where to push down. And you push down right on the lines because those are where the frets would be. So instead of pushing in the middle of a square kind of thing, you push right on where the line is because that's where you're shortening the string to. But I think it's way easier to be out of tune and have intonation issues with the fretless. But one advantage of it is if your ear is really good and you're sliding up to a note, you're actually pulling the, especially the polyurethane strings. This doesn't happen with the metal strings as much, but you're kind of pulling the string together. So sometimes where you end up, the note ends up a little out of tune from where it is. So the good thing about fretless is if you need to go a little bit further to make up for that loss in pitch, like that loss in string tension, then you can. So that's kind of a cool thing that you can do with the fretless over sliding on the rubber strings on the normal U bass or just any U bass. So I want to try putting flat wounds on here. I'm a little scared to do it because this instrument doesn't have a truss rod, and that extra tension that the flat wounds might put on there might break the neck. It's a good thing to have a truss rod because it's just extra support going through and it connects the neck to the body stronger than just it being glued on or whatever they're doing here. So I'm kind of afraid to do it, but at the same time, I don't play this one much. Because it's just there's just a little bit more work to stay in tune. I'm gonna turn the treble down a little bit so there's not so strong of an attack. You can hear the strings are really noisy right now because I have a little bit of sweat on my fingers, and so they're kind of sticky and sticking to the strings. But hopefully that gives you an idea. As far as fretless full scale bass, I did have one for a long time, and I still have a 6-string fretless that needs a little bit of work to play. But I like it a lot. But same thing where it's just you have to pay a lot more attention. You have to use your ear a lot more, which is not a bad thing. So if you want to develop your ear playing fretless and getting good at playing along with songs in tune will really help your ear out. And it'll help your confidence in your ear too, because if you're not confident in it, you won't want to play the fretless out in a gig setting, for instance. So I like fretless. I like the way that they kind of purr. The metal strings purr a little bit better than this, but you can hear it with that vibrato. You can get a wider vibrato, easier, and I think with the rubber strings, it sounds even more like an upright bass, just because upright basses don't have frets. So I guess that's my pretty full opinion. If you have any specific questions, things that I missed that you're curious about, just let me know, and I'll be happy to elaborate on a point. What brand is my fretless? That is a really good question, because it says like JAQ or JACQUES, Jacques or something, but it's a sticker. So I wonder if that's one of those things where somebody makes an instrument, somebody else buys those instruments, and then, you know, sells them on Amazon or whatever and puts their sticker on there. So I don't know if that's actually the brand or not. So that's a really good question on this one. I think it is, though, because there's also a sticker inside as well, and it says Jacques on it too. Not that they couldn't do that just as easily, but it does seem like kind of interesting. It's a sticker instead of some carving or some engraving, or I don't know what they do on most basses, what you call it, but it is kind of like that. But yes, I really do like fretless instruments. This one had a little bit of things that needed to be done to it, and when I put flat wound strings on this one, if it doesn't destroy it, like I said, I will make a video on it and kind of let you know how it goes. An ideal thing that I would like to do for a fretless is I would like to get one of the ebony U basses and put the flat wound strings on that, and I think that would sound wonderful and look wonderful too. But what I liked about this, besides the fact that it was cheaper, for obvious reasons, it is a cheaper instrument, but it cost a lot less as well, is it looks more like an upright bass because it has the F holes and they're slightly bigger than they are on the Journeyman. So I kind of like that look. I kind of like compare them. I'm thinking about doing a video where I compare the fretless to the upright, and I'll probably make 2 videos because I'll probably do one with these strings and then trade them out and do one with the flat wound strings as well. So hopefully that'll be kind of fun. Acklot. I don't think I'm familiar with that brand, but that's awesome. Very, very cool. So does anybody else have any questions about the basses or the U basses or upright bass, or any comparison questions, or any other string questions or anything of that nature? Whoa. Yeah, it's really hard for me to stay in tune on this one because I don't think the dots are in the right place. I think I've said that before, but I think the dots are just slightly off from the pitch they're supposed to be. So sometimes I try to use that instead of just using my ear, and it makes it harder. Like you can hear it out of tune a little bit, can't you? Yeah, like this note should be right smack dab in the middle of these 2 dots, and instead I had to bring it back down to there. So fretless is harder to play. I'll give you guys that. So if you're a beginner and you want to play fretless, you may want to start on fretted first, unless you know that your heart lies with fretless and you're always going to play fretless, then you might want to start on that and just stick to it. But the choice is yours. All right. So I hope that answered your questions. If you got any more, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I've got a lot of ideas for different comparisons coming up, so I'm hoping I can do all of those. But I also have some Patreon requests coming up. So, every patron that signs up, basically I get their song and I put it on a list. So if I already had like an idea for the week, sometimes I'll do that idea for the week and then do the Patreon request the following week. But right now I have 2 Patreon requests, and I believe one of them is going to come up second. So it might be 2 or 3 weeks from now will actually be Jeff's. And I think Jeff's on here. So it is on the list, and I am planning on doing that probably in 2 weeks. It might be 3, because I may want to throw one comparison in between the 2. But it's definitely on the list, and I'm happy to do that. But if you become a patron, you get a song added to the list. So that's the idea. So I'm going to play another loop pedal thing. I think I'm going to make something up. I want somebody in the chat to give me a key to play in. I want somebody else to give me a style to play in. And then I'll either start with the drum beat or I'll start with the chords, just so that you guys can get more of an idea of the chords in action. So, and I'll answer this question right before we jump in. Okay, so we're doing a blues. Okay. And what key? And I'm going to answer your question real quick. When playing 1-3-5, my pinky tends to fly up. How do I correct this? In what way does it fly up? So like, let's say you're playing 1-3-5. Where does it fly up? Because I'm not quite sure. So we're going to do a blues in E. And is there any... So there's different types of blueses as well. There's a blues shuffle kind of feel. Then there's a slow blues. Or we could do like a more rock kind of blues where it's more root note based. So if you want a certain kind of blues, we can do that. Coming back to E. When you're doing 1-3-5 and going back to 3, like going 1-3-5 3. You're saying it goes like 1-3-5 3, like that, like way out. So I think the main thing is just kind of getting used to what you have to do with the 3. That might mean that you're squeezing, right? Rather than pulling into the neck like this, that when you get back to that 3rd, you might be squeezing, which causes that your whole hand to go like that, which might bring your pinky up. So maybe the answer is don't squeeze as hard and just lift it slightly up, It does come up a little, though. It is supposed to come off of the string, of course. Okay. Yeah, I was kind of exaggerating it so you could kind of see it on there, but see, like for me, it kind of stays around an inch off the string, so it's okay if you're even an inch off the string. It's not too big of a deal. When you're playing faster, it'll come up more like a centimeter off the string rather than an inch off the string. But if it's not coming up that much further than that, I wouldn't worry about it. Or if you were talking about playing 1, 3, and 5 at the same time, like this or something, then I would say it has to stay down. And it's just hard to play chords on bass like that. So if that's the case, that is a little bit trickier. Okay, and that just takes some practice and some work at it, and we don't want to do it too much because it does kind of put your wrist in an interesting position. So we're going to do a shuffle. So I'm going to use a line that I'm going to borrow from a few blues tunes that use this. I think it's most commonly known and Tore Down. So I'm basically going to do a line that sounds like the song I'm Tore Down, and I'm just going to solo over it as well. And what I'm going to do with the chords is, how we were talking about the 7th chords? When I do those 7th chords, I'm going to leave off the root note because I'm going to be playing the root note on the bass line. So I'm just going to play the 3rd and the 7th of each of those chords. It's easier to play, 1. And 2, it will muddy the sound up less to have that 3rd note here when I'm playing down there. Okay. So let's see, a blues style bass line. Okay. Maybe I'll start with the bass line on this actually, because that just makes more sense on this particular thing. So here we go. All right. All right. So now we finally got a bass line, chords, and the drum part. So now I'm going to solo over it a little bit. And we can use the blues scale to solo over it. And sometimes I'll go major, just kind of use the Mixolydian mode. All right, so there's a blues and E for you guys. Thanks you guys so much for tuning in. If you have any final questions, you got probably a minute to type them in. Once again, I wanted to mention that my Skype prices right now for lessons, if you wanted to do online lessons with me, are a little bit lower than they normally are because I lowered them since we're all staying at home and everything. But I'm ending that discount at the end of May. So right now, you're getting $10 off of lessons. Basically, they're $20 for a 30-minute lesson rather than $30. And at the end of May, they're just going to go back up to 30. So I just want to throw that out there in case anybody was just wondering if I was teaching lessons. But that's about it for today. So if you have any more questions, once again, about the bass, about anything, it could be the way I film, it could be the microphone, just whatever, just let me know. And I will do this again next Saturday, of course. And I will have a lesson out for you guys on Tuesday as well. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to give y'all another 5, 4 to come up with a question. 3, 2, 1. All right, guys. I'll see you next time.